This is Professor Alviso, and this is video 3 for Multicultural Music in America. This is going to be a short video that gets into cultural considerations and gets into concepts from anthropology, ethnomusicology. I'm going to talk about traditional, classical, and popular music, the roles of music, and we're going to do a review for quiz number 1 that summarizes a lot of the things that we've covered so far. So let's get started. So let's quickly cover some concepts from anthropology. Anthropology is the study of culture. What is culture? Culture is the system of knowledge by which we design our actions and interpret the actions of others. It's not something innate. It's not something we are born with. It's something we pick up from others, from adults, from peers as we grow up. It's dependent on geography, environment, history, language, and many other factors. As a result, there's many different cultures throughout the planet, all very distinct. Ethnomusicology is the study of music as culture. In other words, we're not studying the notes necessarily or the analysis of what's happening in the music. We're talking about the meaning of the music, why it's important, its function, its role, its purpose. Music culture is the total involvement of a group of people with music, not only the music itself, but ideas about music. How music makes us feel, how music is connected to identity, pride, nationalism, and ideas like that. Ethnocentrism is the view that your own culture is the only good culture. It's the best or the only way of doing things. In order to do well in this class and appreciate other people and other ways of life, it's important that we check that at the door and that we're aware of our own biases. Typically in the past, anthropologists believed that it was important to be objective. Objectivity is a reliance on facts versus feelings. But more recently, not only in anthropology, but all social sciences, the view that we must sort of acknowledge our biases is come into practice. So it's important that we realize that we all have biases, that we all have preferences based on growing up that are impossible for us to disregard. So it's impossible for us to acknowledge our preferences and our biases when we're studying other cultures and when we're studying music, and have an open mind as much as possible. Cultural relativism is the doctrine that there is no single set of values that work for all cultures. As a result, every culture and every music must be judged in its own context. Let's talk about 3 different classifications of music: traditional, classical, and popular. Traditional music is the oldest. Sometimes we call it folk music. They're somewhat synonymous, but there is a distinction. But for this class, traditional and folk basically mean the same thing. This is music passed down by regular people, by regular folk. Music played by regular folk in informal contexts, passed down through oral tradition, through family members, and normally associated with rural environments. Traditional folk music goes back to the beginning of time when humans first started interacting, first started developing civilization, cultures, and communicating with one another. You see 3 different photos of traditional music there. Anglo-American traditional music in the Appalachians, an African-American work song on a railroad, and a fandango, which is a gathering with music and dance in Mexican-American culture. Classical music, on the other hand, involves professional musicians, and most likely classical music started developing in kingdoms when the king or the rulers wanted to have a court orchestra. So they gathered the best musicians from the countryside, brought them into the palace, and started developing a professional kind of music. You find it not only in Europe with orchestras, but you find it in many parts of the world. Japan, China, Korea, India, Indonesia, parts of Africa, the Middle East. These are all places where you had empires, and the rulers wanted to have music to entertain people in the palace or in the kingdom. So, with classical music, you have professional musicians that are trained using theory and trained by master musicians. They perform their music in formal contexts, like concert halls, and, as I said before, it's normally associated with royal courts and urban environments. Around the year 1900 to 1920, music changed significantly because of two inventions, the phonograph and the radio. So, we have a new classification of music that really takes off called popular music. That's music disseminated by mass media. Even before the radio and phonograph, you had popular songs that were popular because of what we used to call broadsides. These were lyric sheets that were mass-produced and given out to the countryside or in the city of songs that were being performed in city dance halls or music halls. But really, it's the phonograph and radio that really helps popular music become a very, very, very significant classification of music. When we talk about popular music, we're talking about styles that really are associated with recordings. This is the kind of music that you listen to most of the time. Hip-hop, R&B, rock, any of those styles are popular music styles. You don't need to be a professional or to be a trained musician to play it. Some training is required, but not as much training as is required for a classical musician, say, for instance. And many scholars argue that the most enduring, long-lasting styles of popular music originate in the urban underclass. That's the most poor, most oppressed, most alienated segment of the population. Think of the development of styles of music like hip-hop, which was developed by the most disaffected black kids in Compton and parts of New York. Or think of styles of music like flamenco, which was developed by the gypsies, the most oppressed people in Spain. Or tango music, which was developed in bordellos and houses of prostitution in Buenos Aires. Or the blues, which was developed in the South by former slaves. Do you agree or disagree with that theory that the most enduring and lasting styles of popular music originate in the underclass? Can you think of any exceptions? I can't. Ethnomusicologists like myself are interested in the role and meaning of music within the culture. Music is historically constructed, socially maintained, but individually experienced. And all these things come together in talking about why the music's important, what it means to the culture, to the society, and the people themselves individually. I like to think of the first three as sort of the big three in this class: dance, spirituality, and storytelling. You're going to find that most of the examples that we talk about in this class are chosen because they illustrate an important part of the culture and the history of that particular group of people, or in American culture itself. So most of the examples that we're going to be talking about in this class fall into one of those categories. It's music to dance to, it's music to worship to, or it's music to tell stories. But stories aren't just stories. Stories impart meaning, they impart morals and ethics, and there's many other roles that we're going to find as we look at some of the music within this class. Work, you're going to hear some work songs, some songs that are definitely meant to court individuals for people to fall in love to, especially while they're dancing as well. A lot of the music we're going to talk about involves or accompanies some kind of ritual. And as I said before, ethics and morals are an important part of what's being imparted. And ultimately, music is a part of all of our identity. If you think of yourself and what kind of music or what cultures sort of represent your identity, there's probably an intersection of many different kinds of musics that make up who you are and who help you to identify with a group of people or a culture. In my case, for instance, you see a piano behind me. I love classical piano, but I also fell in love with Zimbabwean music. So you see a Zimbabwean marimba and an mbira behind me, a thumb piano. But I also spent a lot of time playing rock and roll and playing various kinds of music that also I consider a part of my identity as well. So it's not only the music that my parents listened to, which was a lot of Spanish language music, but also the music that I picked up from my peers that represent a lot of my identity, and also music and culture that I picked up along the way as I grew up that I feel represent an important part of my identity. There was a radio show that I used to love on KCRW in Santa Monica called Castaway's Choice. And in this radio program, the host used to bring in important people. And it wasn't always just entertainers or musicians. Sometimes it was business people or politicians. And the host used to ask them to name their 10 desert island pieces of music that they would take if they were castawayed on a desert island. I think that's a really interesting way of sort of figuring out what your musical identity is. Because if I had to name my 10 most important pieces of music that I would listen to if I only had 10 pieces of music to listen to, it would probably be a very diverse list. And the same thing is probably true for you. So, as we're going through this class, think about the purpose and the meaning of music and what it means to the culture and individuals. One of the most interesting roles of music, because this list that you see here is not by any means complete. I love the story that was told to me by a Corsican musician. Corsica is, I believe, part of France, but it has a lot of cultural affinity with Italy. When we were talking about the roles of music, he said, I know a piece of music or an instrument that's meant to avoid paying taxes. And I said, explain that. He said, there's an instrument, a friction drum, that you rub this stick that's connected to a drum, and it makes such a terrible sound that you can hide in a tree or hide behind a rock when the tax collector comes on a horse to come collect taxes from the village. And the sound is so terrible that it scares the horse. The horse rears up. The tax collector falls to the ground and breaks his neck. So that instrument is designed to avoid paying taxes. That's the role of that instrument. I think that tells you that the roles and meaning and the functions of music are quite as varied as the human experience. So this is, part of the fun of this class is looking at what music means to people and how it connects us to others and connects us to meaning within our own lives. Let's do a quick review of our listening examples for Quiz 1. If you remember, way back, Shoe Fly was the first example I played for you. You should know that in Shoe Fly, you have an interaction of many of the cultures that we're studying in this class. European instruments, African rhythms, Latino rhythms, musicians dressed as Native Americans. The only culture not represented is Asian Americans. We did the same with Old Man Rooster. We looked at which cultures were represented. It has a European instrument tune and instruments in a Latino style. The musicians themselves are Native Americans. There's very little, if any, African and Asian influence represented in that piece. Listening example 1-3 is a work song. John Henry is monophonic, and even though I didn't talk about the story itself, you read about it inside the textbook. It's a work song that pits man versus machine, and there's a story that goes along with it. It's duple meter, work song, man versus machine. You can read more about it in your textbook, and we're going to talk a little bit more about it when we get into chapter 4. Listening example 1-4 and 1-5 were both examples of blues, but listening example 1-4, Cold Drink of Water Blues, had a more relaxed vocal timbre and slower tempo, reflecting a little bit more of a rural environment, versus listening example 1-5, Preaching Blues, which had a tense vocal timbre and a fast tempo, which reflects a little bit more of an urban environment or urban aesthetics for the blues. You should know that listening example 1-8, Walk Daniel, is a spiritual, an African American spiritual, an old religious song with only singing, no instruments. The singing is organized in a call and response fashion where you have a leader being answered by a group. That kind of singing style is called call and response. Listening example 1-10, Precious Lord, Take My Hand, is another African American song, this time a gospel song. Gospel is more modern and has not only singing but also instruments. You hear piano and singing in that piece, and there is no meter in that song. It has a free rhythm. Listening example 1-11 is another gospel song, Highway to Heaven. And in that piece, if you just listen to the voices are in a heterophonic texture where the male lead singer is singing the same line, the same melody, the same words as the choir, but he's adding ornamentation and changing up the rhythm. That texture where you have one basic melody sung or played by two or more people, each with their own distinct ornamentation and rhythm, is called heterophonic texture. Listening example 1-12 is an Irish medley. It's a medley of jigs. These are triple meter dances from Ireland. Listening example 1-13, Amity, is an Anglo-American gospel song, and we listened to a part of the song that had many voices, 4 different voices, the soprano, alto, tenor, and bass, each singing different melodies at the same time. 4 different melodies, independent and all equally interesting. When you have many melodies at the same time, that texture is polyphonic. Listening example 1-14, Amazing Grace, was an example of men and women singing together at the interval of an octave. That's all you need to know about that one for now. Listening example 1-15, Down to the River to Pray, is an example of homophonic texture. You have only singers in that example, but Alison Krauss's melody is really the main melody, and everybody else is just singing chords. It's an example of Anglo-American gospel. Listening example 1-16, Willow Garden, is a ballad. You will hear the following instruments: guitar, banjo, and fiddle. And all of those instruments are examples of chordophones. Those are instruments where you have vibrating strings. Listening example 117, The Two Sisters, like Willow Garden, is a ballad. A ballad is a song that tells a story. You heard two different excerpts of that listening example. It's the same song, the same story, separated over thousands of miles. The first version is one of the original, or it's an older version, most likely, that comes from Scotland. The second version comes from Appalachia. Both have an arched contour, or an arched shape. Listening example 2.8, Un Mojado Sin Licencia is an example of Mexican-American norteño music, and it is in duple meter. We will talk more about that in the second half of the semester. Finally, as far as listening examples, you also heard example 220, Gendai ni Ikiru, which is an example of Japanese-American taiko drumming. Many layers of rhythm means polyrhythmic texture. To prepare for quiz 1, in addition to all the listening examples we just talked about, you should study all the terms that we covered in videos 1, 2, and 3. Always ask if you're unsure of anything. So, study your listening examples, study all your notes, studying all your terms, and you should do well on quiz number 1. Next, after the quiz, starting in week 4 and 5, we will begin studying African American music and culture, blues, gospel, and other styles of African American music.